Hello, colleagues. Thank you for watching my presentation. I want to talk to you about my findings concerning money on the move, or more technically speaking, remittances. So to get us started, take a look at this map. This is indicating remittance inflows around the world. The bigger circles indicate a greater amount of remittance inflows. So we see some big circles in Mexico, China, India, Philippines, etc. Now let's take a look at another map quickly. This one depicts government effectiveness. Darker colors indicate a higher score from the World Bank. Lighter colors indicate a lower score. So we see places with a high score, not surprisingly, United States and Canada, Western Europe, Australia. Lower scores in countries throughout Africa, Central Asia. Take a quick peek at Mexico there. Had a big circle for remittances, but a red high score for government effectiveness. So in my exploratory research, I was weeding through some of these maps and noticing, some of these countries receiving more remittances also have lower government effectiveness scores. I wonder if there's a story to be told here. So my research question became, how do remittance inflows increase or decrease government effectiveness? So I'll run through what I did by talking about my hypothesis and my method for collecting and analyzing the data, as well as what the current literature is saying about the topic. And finally, I'll talk about how my original question evolved into a more narrow one and where I plan to go from here. I'm going to give you some definitions so we all know what we're talking about, and I'll get a little more technical in a minute. But put simply, remittances are peer-to-peer transfer of funds across borders. Government effectiveness, as most of you know, is a score put out by the World Bank, counts for a number of indicators, but for this conversation, we'll borrow a definition from the literature, which is the extent to which resources are devoted to increasing the welfare of a representative agent rather than diverted for other purposes. So after doing some initial reading, my hypothesis became, as remittance inflows increase, government effectiveness decreases. In other words, as remittance get sent back to a country, that money will not help run a more effective government, but rather will correlate to lower government effectiveness scores. Now, I got this idea from piecing together the work of some leading scholars on the topic of remittances and government corruption. And in this particular piece, they analyze data from 111 countries using a cross-section from 1990 to 2000, and they find that remittances affect government corruption in two ways. First, it expands the tax base, so even though remittances aren't taxed themselves, and also it allows households to purchase goods which would otherwise be provided by the government. So they found that there was a negative and significant relationship between remittances and corruption, suggesting that as more remittances come in, households do not have to bear the cost of government corruption as heavily, and resources are diverted elsewhere for the government's own purposes. And then Lardy and Mengova look at the argument and say, when it comes to developing countries, we should look at it from a different direction. What if the quality of institutions affects the flow of remittances? And indeed, they find that in regard to developing and transitioning countries, there's a positive and significant relationship between strong institutions and remittances. So I say, this is leading me to believe that there is some kind of story to tell between remittances and government effectiveness, and can we tell it on a larger scale? And I continue to find similar stories woven throughout the literature, so I say, okay, let's see what happens when we zoom out the lens and tell a bigger story. So I start collecting data from the World Bank. I use remittances and GDP both in US millions of dollars, government effectiveness, and then I use data from 2005 and 2015. Now, to be clear, this is not a time series, so there were two separate data sets for those years. I decide to use remittance as a percentage of GDP for my independent variable or predictor variable, and I do this as opposed to looking at straight up remittances because, for instance, two countries could have the same amount of remittance inflows, but differing levels of GDP wouldn't really be a fair calculation. My dependent variable is government effectiveness. So this variable comes directly from the World Bank and captures a robust amount of information, including quality of public services and civil services, independence from political pressures, policy formation, and the credibility of the government to implement those. So the World Bank does most of the heavy lifting and gives us a nice score to use to analyze with other variables. So because both of my variables are continuous, I use a bivariate regression analysis along with correlation. So I get all the data cleaned, loaded into R. Now remember, this is not a time series set, so I create two different models for the data from 2005 and 2015. Now, I must be candid here. The results were a little less exciting than I was hoping, but alas, this is research, so let me tell you what I found anyway. So, both of my scatter plots looked very similar, like this. This one is for the 2005 data set. Not extremely exciting, but I thought maybe my eyes deceived me. Let's check the correlations. Both data sets were correlated at approximately -0.2. So it wasn't just 0, they are correlated, but only very weakly. Although I was happy to see it was in the negative direction, which I had hypothesized. In addition, the p-values yielded significant results. Interesting. But I'm still not exactly sure what's going on here. So I take a look at my residuals. Here they are. For time's sake, since they're both similar, I'm just going to show you this one from my 2005 data. But as you can see, it does not get the big check mark. I would have liked to see a plot with more equal variability on either side of the line, but as we discover, this is not the case, and therefore I conclude that this model, while it has a significant p-value, it doesn't explain a lot of the variability. I should also say here that both had low R-squared values as well, so this backs up my sinking feeling that although there might be a relationship between remittances and government effectiveness, I do not feel confident offering precise predictions or explaining causality with this model. So why might this be? Well, we could have an endogeneity problem, which I did not control for. For example, the likelihood that corrupt and inefficient governments might also have higher emigration and thus more remittances. I think it's also possible that in trying to get a larger story, we perhaps zoomed out too far and didn't control for enough factors that could be playing into the country level data, such as economics, legal variables, or perhaps a more strategic picking of countries would have given us different results. However, when I thought through how I would do that, I didn't really have the research to back up my decision on countries to choose, and I didn't want it to be arbitrary. So I went back to the research to see if I could uncover anything else. Now, remember this map, I showed it to you at the beginning. Mexico receives a significant amount of remittances, but comparatively speaking has higher government effectiveness. In the literature, we see this issue of corruption coming up when we look at government effectiveness, and a number of researchers are saying that remittances provide a causal mechanism by which to understand corruption. But a couple of scholars, and one in particular that I read closely, Taberski, noticed a different story being told in Mexico. And he argues that remittances help increase government accountability and lessen corruption. So I thought about why this might be and what kind of data I could collect to perhaps tell a different story about what's going on in Mexico and why it's different from other places around the globe. Because I knew that it receives a lot of remittances, which make up about 2% of GDP. So I consider that it could have something to do with an indicator within the government effectiveness variable. Many of the indicators have to do with amount and distribution of public services, and where that is also a variable in considering corruption in other countries, I reason that perhaps we can unpack this story by looking at how immigration and remittances that are sent back affect public services in Mexico. So I start collecting some data when I get a surprise from Professor Vicasi. Lo and behold, somebody who she studied with during her PhD has done this exact research. Her name is Emily Sellers. So I was affirmed that it was a good idea for further research, but Indeed, as many of you have probably found in your projects, your brilliant ideas have already been done. But let me tell you briefly what she found and where I would take the next step. Her dissertation covered a larger immigration story, but one chapter focused on how immigration affects public services. And she found that using data from the Mexican Family Life Survey, which surveys about 8,000 families in 150 different communities, she found that immigration indeed increases household and community wealth through remittances, but this does not yield an increase in public services provided. So, where would I take this? Given that Mexico has a number of groups, such as hometown associations, that respond to community needs through collective action, I would look at community cooperation and see what the story is in communities that receive larger amounts of remittances. Perhaps I would ask the question, does an increase in remittance inflows cause a decrease in community cooperation in Mexico? But that is for another time. However, this is an important topic and one that is increasingly being brought up in our news lately, and I hope to continue to untangle what is really taking place in communities where remittances are prevalent and what kinds of impacts they have on the governments at large. Once again, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments.